Welcome to Malifaux University. 407. Terrain. Dense and Concealing. Malifaux is a rich, immersive experience with intricate models. When well-painted models are put on a well-decorated table, the game is even better. Terrain can be tricky, and it comes with many layers of rules that affect gameplay. This video will explain what dense and concealing terrain does. Video 408 covers destructible, severe, and hazardous terrain. Video 409 addresses terrain with the impassable and climbable characteristics. And Video 410 covers height and blocking and the shadow those traits create. This applies to terrain that is placed on the table during setup or markers that are created or dropped during gameplay that have these characteristics and therefore are considered terrain. Dense terrain is fairly simple to handle. This trait is usually found on forests and fog banks, but you might apply it to other features such as a waterfall, a volcanic steam vent, or a garden filled with bamboo. Models cannot see all the way through dense terrain, regardless of how much space on the table it takes up. A model can draw line of sight into it or out of it, but never all the way through it. This applies to all ranged actions, whether they are projectile attacks or not. If Jacob Lynch wanted to use his Derringer projectile attack on these two mindless zombies, he could target the one inside the forest, but not the one on the other side of the forest. He can draw line of sight into the dense terrain, but not all the way through it. Dense terrain's lighter cousin is concealing terrain. Models can see through concealing terrain, but if any sight lines pass through concealing terrain, then the target model is said to have concealment, which doesn't actually affect the target model. When you target a model that has concealment with any ranged attack action, the action has a negative modifier. This applies specifically to non-melee attack actions, so tactical actions would not be affected by concealment. Also remember that shockwaves are not affected by concealment, but other pulse game effects are. If Jacob targets Asura Rotten through this tall grass that before the game was determined to be concealing but not dense, he would have a negative modifier on his Derringer attack since one of his sightlines crosses through the concealing terrain. When the illuminated pops off a scintillating cloud, he doesn't care about Asura's concealment since this is a shockwave attack that ignores it. If a model is inside concealing terrain and draws line of sight to a target, the model taking the action is still subject to the concealing effect the terrain provides, unless one of the sight lines to the target passes through less than 1 inch of the concealing terrain. This applies even if both models are inside the same concealing terrain. Let's say it's later in the game and Asura is deep inside the concealing grass. Jacob Lynch and one illuminated minion are inside the grass with her, and another illuminated is outside the grass. If she targets the illuminated outside of the grass with her decay ranged attack, she has a negative modifier since there are about 2 inches of concealing grass between her and the illuminated. Jacob is also outside of 1 inch and would gain concealment as well, but the other illuminated model is within 1 inch of Asura. Since this is not a projectile attack, she can use decay against the illuminated without penalty despite his 1 inch engagement range. I'll take a brief moment now to thank all those who were patrons at the time this video was made, especially Griff, Sergey, Tom, Alan, Jeremy, Mikolai, and Travis, and many more at the free student tier. Your support is essential to bringing these videos to life. Here it's important to understand that all apples are fruit, but not all fruits are apples. Pretty much all dense terrain will also have the concealing trait, but not all concealing terrain is dense. The grass we just saw is an example of this latter case. The grass is concealing, but is not dense, so there is no problem with the models shooting each other across it when they were both outside of it. In the earlier example of Jacob Lynch shooting the zombies with his Derringer, he still cannot shoot the one behind the dense forest. When targeting the zombies inside the forest, he has a negative modifier against both of them, even though one is very close to the edge and Jacob's sightline passes through less than 1 inch of the concealing terrain. That's because only a model inside the concealing terrain may ignore 1 inch of it when targeting. If Jacob were the one inside the forest drawing line of sight to 3 different zombies, this one outside the forest and the one inside the forest would have concealment, because Jacob's sight lines pass through more than an inch of the terrain. He would have no penalty targeting the other zombie outside the forest, because he is close to the edge of the forest and his sightline passes through less than an inch of forest. There are some models that create concealing terrain. Models like Cornelius Bass and the Frontier keyword drop concealing dust cloud markers that sit on the table and are handled like any other piece of concealing terrain. But what about when the terrain is an aura centered on the model? Basically, it becomes a mobile space of terrain. If Kurai Ankoku, envoy of the court, cast into the mist on herself, she would create an aura of concealing terrain radiating 3 inches out from her base that affects only enemy models. If she were standing between Jacob Lynch and Asura Rotten, Jacob would have a negative modifier with his Derringer to shoot Kurai or Asura, but neither of those 2 resurrectionist ladies would suffer the concealment penalty if they return fire, since the action says only enemy models are affected. If Jacob were here, inside Kurai's 3-inch aura, he could ignore the concealment when targeting Asura, since there'd be less than an inch of the concealing terrain between them, but would still have a negative modifier when targeting Kurai due to the distance between them. Models that ignore concealment do not ignore terrain, just the concealment effect of the terrain. If Kavatica and the Cadmus crew were in an encounter with Cornelius Bass, who had already dropped a 50mm concealing severe dust cloud marker on the table, Kavatica could ignore the concealing effect of the dust cloud marker when using his called-out ranged attack action, because it says it ignores concealment. If he tries to move across the dust cloud marker, he is still affected by the severe nature of the terrain, moving at half the normal rate. That's the overview of Dense and Concealing Terrain. Pick up a printable set of all the markers and tokens you need to play Malifaux in the Wargames Vault. If you haven't already, join our Patreon for early, ad-free access to all new content. And be sure to visit the Malifaux University gift shop for the latest in Malifaux-themed shirts, hoodies, drinkware, and more. Links are in the notes below. And remember, play friendly games, keep it simple, and have fun.